Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. And in the final little tutorial of 2023, we're going to look at some search engine optimization. So you can go into your homepage, go into settings, just here as you've seen, and there's a list of things you can customize to make your website appear more or change how it appears in Google searches. You've got various options, as you can see there. This shows you what it's going to look like. There's some additional pages if you want to people to find specific pages on your website. I'm not particularly bothered by that, so I'm happy with the settings I've already preset for the home page, which you can see there at the beginning. There's the custom description I've written in the bottom. But of course, your website doesn't necessarily just have to appear on Google search. So if you go back in there, you can see that you can also customize how it appears when it's linked on things like Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. I might change that picture because that's not brilliantly formatted, but you see there's a nice easy upload box down there at the bottom where you can do that. And if you happen to be a little bit of a code monkey, you can put your own custom code in there as well. So nice and easy to optimize your page however you want. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. In this mini-series, we're going to explore the various frigate duels on the high seas that occurred throughout the War of 1812. The reason that this is going to be a Friday mini-series is essentially trying to do a War of 1812 on the high seas video turns out to be pretty much impossible. There are too many ship versus ship encounters and too many tactics and so forth to explain. It essentially would turn that into a video series itself. But the frigate duels in particular have extremely varying amounts of relevant information available about them, at least reliable stuff, which means that a Wednesday series, if we were covering the war with one frigate duel per segment, might sometimes come up a little bit short and other times might run over quite an amount. So by doing them here on Fridays, if one of them runs a little short or a little long, it doesn't matter quite so much. It also means that when I do get round to doing a video or two or three about the oceanic side of the War of 1812 as a whole, I can cover all the little details and all those little bits of history that you really like, as well as the overall grand strategy. But when it comes to the individual frigate duels, I can just refer people over to this series if you want to hear exactly what happened in each action. But with that said, in any case, we're going to start 2 months and 1 day after the formal declaration of war was signed. There'd already been one naval engagement on the Great Lakes and one at sea, that being the capture of the sloop HMS Alert by the frigate USS Essex, but this engagement, the one we're looking at now, would involve the ship that would acquire the nickname Old Ironsides, which is of course USS Constitution herself. To be fair, she'd not had the most auspicious start to the war, sailing out under her captain, Isaac Hull, to try and meet up with a squadron under the command of her previous captain, John Rogers. He was leading a fairly powerful formation made up of the frigates President, United States and Congress, along with the brigs Hornet and Argus. On the 17th of July 1812, Constitution had sighted 5 warships cruising off the New Jersey coast and thought, hey, I found my friends. Unfortunately, it turned out to be 4 British frigates, Aeolus, Belvidera, who'd actually already had a run-in with Rogers' squadron, Shannon, who we'll meet again in a later video, and Guerriere. Along with them was the small 64-gun third-rate HMS Africa, who on this channel we last met taking on a third of the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar before squaring up to the mighty Santissima Trinidad. Recognising a losing prospect when he saw one, Hull made to flee, but both sides then found themselves becalmed, leading to what was almost certainly the slowest naval chase in recorded history, as with all sails set and wetted with water to catch the slightest breeze, and a mixture of ship's boats towing, as well as repeatedly setting and then the ship hauling in its anchors, a practice known as kedging, the entire collection of shipping inched their way along the still sea. In the end, dropping a bunch of supplies overboard to lighten the ship, as well as being the first to catch a rising breeze, finally got Constitution to safety, but it wasn't exactly a great start to things. However, just over a month after a chase that had gone on for so long you could almost have grown the corn to make the popcorn, which you might want to consume whilst watching it, Constitution was out looking for a lone British frigate, which had been reported in her new sailing area, which was somewhat further to the north. Soon, she spotted one of her erstwhile pursuers, HMS Guerriere. Guerriere was a formerly French frigate, you might have guessed that by the name. Built in the last few years of the 1700s, she was technically actually a couple of years younger than Constitution, and had served for about 6 years in the French Navy, almost being captured twice, once by HMS Elephant and another time by HMS Culloden, both ships of the line, until her luck had finally run out in July 1806 when she was captured by the frigate HMS Blanche. Refitted and commissioned into the Royal Navy, she'd then spent the bulk of the intervening period, until now, patrolling the Caribbean and Western Atlantic, taking a number of French prizes, as well as being the cause of the USS Spitfire incident, which in turn led to the Little Belt Affair, and which in turn had almost kicked off a war a little bit earlier than has historically occurred. By now, however, she was more than a little worn out and in desperate need of a refit. Indeed, the reason she was no longer attached to the rest of the squadron that had previously pursued Constitution was that she'd been detached to attain just such a refit over in Halifax. Nominally rated at 38 guns, she actually carried a larger armament, remembering that the ship's rating is for the number of gun ports that the hull is pierced for, not necessarily the total number of guns aboard. She was actually carrying somewhere around 48 or 49 guns, depending on your source, consisting of 28 to 30 18-pounder long guns, entirely or almost entirely on the main gun deck, with another 16 32-pounder carronades on the upper deck, some of them with gun ports and some of them just out in the open, and then there were also either 2 9-pounder long guns or 2 12-pounder long guns and an 18-pounder carronade up front. In the aftermath, Constitution reported her armament as being 30 18-pounders, 16 32-pounders, 2 12-pounder long guns, and an 18-pounder howitzer, which doesn't help as it matches up mostly with some of those other reports, but the 12-pound howitzer is a bit of a mystery. Who knows, maybe the 18-pounder carronade ended up pointing at the sky or something. Constitution, meanwhile, was nominally rated at 44 guns, but also was carrying more than that. Although the exact cited figure, again, varies. Everyone agrees that she was carrying 30 24-pounder long guns on her gun deck, with 32-pounder carronades stationed above. But exactly how many 32-pounders varies by source. Some say 20, others say 24. One even goes as high as to suggest 32 32-pounder carronades, with varying amounts of bow chasers cited. Either no dedicated bow chasers, a single 18-pounder, or a pair of additional 24-pounder long guns. This would mean that the ship was armed with somewhere between 52 and 63 guns. Theodore Roosevelt, in his book on the War of 1812, lists 55 guns carried for this engagement. Matters aren't helped by the fact that Constitution changed the makeup of her armament at least 3 times during the war. Whatever the precise numbers involved, the US ship was carrying more and heavier guns into this fight, although, as Roosevelt also notes, American-made guns at this time were somewhat more prone to exploding as opposed to firing compared to other people's cannon, and the weight of shot that was being issued was often a little bit short of what it should have been. Various reasons are given for this, but one of the more commonly cited is people being a little bit corrupt and essentially doing an ammunition version of literal penny pinching. But on the afternoon of the 19th of August, these details didn't matter too much as Constitution was bearing down on Guerriere with the wind at her back. Having gotten a good look at Constitution at relatively close range in the previous chase, Captain Dacre was under no illusion as to the relative capabilities of the two ships, although he was still relatively confident he could take Constitution. Indeed, one of the prisoners aboard, Guerriere, who was obviously later released, reported that Dacre thought he would be made for life if he was the first Royal Navy captain to take an American frigate, and he was quite pleased to see Constitution's aggressiveness, as he thought that this would enhance the reputation of Guerriere once she captured the ship. But since he knew that a straight-up fight was unlikely to go his way, he had to make the best of the situation he had. Now, it does have to be remembered at this point that it was very rare for ships to enter battle under full sail. The risk of damage, fire, and the ship running out of control were too great, not to mention the lower sails could get in the way of general action. Without going into the finer details of which exact sail at which exact station has which precise name, a typical rated vessel of the time, and bearing in mind a rating includes frigates, would have 3 large yards on each mast, these being the horizontal bits that you typically see even when the sails are furled. Some ships did have 4, but most would have 3. The lowest and largest of these sails on each mast would typically then be furled for an action, and exactly which sails above this would be used depended on what the ship was trying to do and what the weather was. But this overall arrangement was generally known as battle sail. In this guise, Guerriere made a run for it. But this wasn't obviously simply fleeing. As mentioned, Dacre was trying to eke out whatever advantages he could get. As long as he maintained a lead, he could periodically swing to present a broadside, which would force the Constitution to either bear off and take hits on the side of her hull. Thus, both sides would lose speed, but Dacre, being in control of where and when this occurred, would in theory lose less, or else the American ship would have to accept a raking broadside coming down the bow. Constitution, on the other hand, was limited to using her bow chasers and whichever of the more forward guns she could bring to bear. This maximised Guerriere's firepower and minimised Constitution's. Dacre was aiming to try and inflict general damage, but in particular to reduce Hull's ability to sail at top speed. If a mast could be brought down, then Constitution might be left slow and unwieldy enough for Guerriere to essentially kite the larger ship in its blind spots and wear it down. But obviously that was a relatively unlikely outcome with long-range gunnery, and the primary aim at some point seems to have shifted over to simply allowing the British ship to gain enough of a speed advantage to escape and perhaps find a friend. Hull could not swing his ship to match the broadsides when Guerriere swung because, as mentioned, each such swing lost speed, and whilst Dacre's broadsides would force Hull to turn as well to avoid being raked, there was nothing particularly compelling Dacre to do anything but keep running at full speed if Hull tried to bring more guns to bear by turning to present his own broadside. Captain Dacre also had 10 Americans aboard as crew, but such was the code of conduct at the time that he gave orders that these men were allowed to stand down and take shelter in the ship's hold for this battle, as they would be fighting against their own countrymen, and Dacre thought that forcing them to do so would be dishonourable. However, to avoid Constitution closing in enough that she might risk losing some ground in exchange for coming about to present a full broadside, Guerriere was forced to keep the range quite open. As a result, for about an hour between 5 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon, much iron was exchanged for precious little effect. This is reportedly the time where Constitution acquired her nickname of Ironsides, later to become Old Ironsides, as long-range 18-pounder shot, obviously robbed of much of its energy by a long flight time, striking at an extreme angle against the frigate's thicker-than-average sides, which were themselves made of atypically strong wood, was at times resulting in the rounds just bouncing harmlessly off into the sea, and other times just embedding themselves rather comically in the hull. Nonetheless, tiring of this game and wanting to settle the action before daylight failed, Hull ordered more sail to be set, especially as it began to look like Dacre was finally making a break for it, his earlier bravado apparently having been worn down somewhat by reality. Within minutes, the superior sailing capabilities of the American ship, combined with Dacre having to be a little bit careful due to his weakened masts, and of course the fact that Constitution was now carrying more sail than Guerriere, meant that Constitution rapidly overhauled the British ship with her starboard battery to the British port. Both sides immediately opened up with as many guns as possible, firing as fast as they possibly could. But within 15 minutes, Guerriere's mizzen, or aftmost, mast fell over to starboard and began to drag the British ship around whilst also slowing her down. Constitution found herself then speeding past her opponent, presenting a dangerous situation, which was exactly why ships generally didn't try to run alongside with a huge speed difference in these 1v1 encounters. In theory, Guerriere could now turn sharply, in this case to port, as Constitution passed her, and thus get in the most devastating kind of raking fire, through the stern. However, aware of this risk and taking advantage of the fallen mast, which was making the British ship somewhat unresponsive to the helm, Constitution decided to swap that scenario over, and instead bore over to starboard, cutting across the path of Guerriere and raking the British ship from bow to stern using Constitution's starboard battery. She then spun almost 180 degrees and repeated the pass using her port battery. The second pass, however, showed exactly why this tactic was incredibly dangerous, as Constitution had now lost speed in 2 tight turns, and suddenly the British ship's bowsprit cut across the aft of Constitution, tangling with the mizzenmast rigging lines. The 2 ships drifted, now locked together. This was a dangerous moment for the American ship, as the bow chasers and some of the starboard bow guns of Guerriere could fire into the aft of Constitution, but the angle the 2 ships were locked at meant that neither the latter's stern chasers nor the bulk of the port battery could be brought to bear in response. Sustained fire into the Constitution's stern could sever the lines that attached the wheel to the rudder, set fires, and possibly even shatter the base of the mizzenmast. If the 2 ships then detached, the British ship could coast forward and rake a crippled Constitution from the stern. However, whilst some fires were started by British gunfire, Constitution's crew used the time between the reloads to put them out, and both sides called for boarding parties. Unfortunately for both sides, the only way to get to the other ship was over the tangle of lines and wood that made up the Guerriere's bowsprit, and both ships were heaving quite wildly in a heavy sea. It was clear that whoever made a sally from one ship to the other would likely have many men cut down, exposed on the narrow approach, and would also lose further men who would simply just fall into the sea. At something of a stalemate, both sides instead commenced a vicious close-range duel of small arms, most of the American casualties occurring at this stage in the battle, including a lieutenant of the Marines, who was killed, the ship's first officer and master, both of whom were wounded. However, Constitution's crew decidedly got the better of this exchange of gunfire. Captain Dacre was hit and wounded, and many others in the forward section of Guerriere were wounded or killed as well. As the wind blew the ships around in something of a circle, it eventually filled Constitution's sails enough to let her draw away. The wrench, combined with the damage from shot previously and the impact of the initial collision, along with most likely not a few severed rigging lines as the bowsprit was torn free, added up to the final straw for Guerriere's much abused and already worn masts. The foremast and mainmast went over on the starboard side, leaving the ship completely without propulsion, and with the masts and sails now acting as massive sea anchors. It had been 25 minutes since the main action had been joined. Seeing that the fight was effectively over, Hull took the chance to run clear of gun range and set about some repairs, which was a fairly typical procedure for the victorious ship at the end of a duel in this time period. She managed to replace much shot-up and severed rigging, and patched up damage to the ship's spars and yards. Half an hour later, at 7 p.m, Constitution, with her rigging in much better shape, bore up to Guerriere once more, who, realising that she had no means of propulsion or course change left, and with the ship wallowing so much that the gun deck ports had to be closed to avoid being swamped, promptly struck her colours. Of the 272 men aboard the British ship at the start of the battle, 15 had been killed, another 8 were wounded so badly that they wouldn't survive the next few days, with another 56 wounded to varying degrees, but would live. This meant a total of 248 prisoners, since of course 10 of the survivors were Americans, who were now free to join Constitution's crew if they wished. Some sources state that these men had all been impressed into the Royal Navy. Others don't make much of a claim whether they were impressed or volunteers, one way or the other. Constitution's much larger 456-strong crew had suffered a total of 7 killed and 7 wounded, almost entirely in that small arms exchange mentioned earlier. Initially, it was thought that Guerriere, after extensive repairs, might make a good addition to the US Navy, and a prize crew was thus placed aboard. However, by the following morning, it was quite clear that combat damage, along with her worn-out condition, meant that she was now in a sinking condition, and so the prize crew and the prisoners were taken aboard the Constitution, and at 3 o'clock on the 20th of August, Guerriere was set ablaze, and a quarter of an hour later the fire reached the magazines, and what was left of her gunpowder stores exploded. Captain Dacre noted the good conduct of the American crew, who ensured that the British sailors' personal property was, where possible, also conveyed off of the ship along with the sailors themselves before her destruction. The war of words over the exact nature of the conflict, in terms of exactly how bad a shape Guerriere had been in before, and what the disparity in men and firepower actually meant for the battle, would commence almost as soon as news of the battle reached both side shores, but that's an argument for another time. The immediate impact of the battle was quite significant on both sides, but in different ways. For the Royal Navy, with over 600 active warships, the loss of one slightly worn-out ex-prize was not in and of itself a major blow. Indeed, the Royal Navy would actually lose 21 ships in 1812 just to the weather, let alone enemy action, but from a morale perspective, the defeat came as a surprise. In the previous 2 decades, the British had at various times fought almost every nation on the planet that had a seagoing navy to speak of, and in around 200 single-ship actions, where both sides had roughly similar capabilities, as opposed to a ship of the line versus a frigate or something like that, they'd only lost 5 times, which meant that there was, broadly speaking, an expectation of victory in single-ship actions. With this turned on its head, there were some serious questions asked of Captain Dacre once he'd been exchanged and brought back to the UK for the standard court-martial that captain always faces in the event of the loss of their ship. However, after recounting his actions, the state of his ship prior to the combat, and the materially superior capabilities of the Constitution, he would be honourably acquitted. Keep that verdict in mind for the next few frigate duels, which of course we'll be covering over the coming months. Conversely, for the Americans, the immediate aftermath materially was actually slightly negative, as of course there was no prize to be had since it had been burned, and with some of Guerriere's shot lodged in her masts, Hull considered that it was unsafe to continue Constitution's cruise, since the shot would serve as either stress points in bad weather if they were left in, or general weak points if they were extracted, and the last thing you wanted to do if you were a raiding ship in an ocean full of Royal Navy vessels was to lose your masts. And she was, of course, also quite heavily loaded with prisoners, albeit they could be offloaded onto a subsequent prize, what was then called a cartel vessel, if they'd chosen to continue with the voyage. Nonetheless, the battle brought Constitution's first cruise to an end, and with it the hope of capturing any subsequent prizes as she went back into port for further repairs. Once repaired, Constitution would have to get back out to sea, past any British ships that might be patrolling off the coast, once again. But the news that one of their frigates had beaten a British frigate was massively morale-boosting to the American population for the exact same reason that it was concerning to the British one. The news also arrived at a time when the War of 1812 as a whole wasn't going too great for the USA. As it turned out, the invasion of Canada was perhaps not going quite as well as they'd initially hoped. It also bolstered the confidence of the US Navy itself, specifically since incidents such as the Leopard Chesapeake affair and other similar ones, including the one with Guerriere and Spitfire prior to the war, combined with the overall reputation of the Royal Navy, had left some rather large questions hanging over the US Navy's ability to do much other than take some merchantmen and then inevitably give a good account of themselves in a series of heroic last stands. But, with this victory under their belt, US captains could feel that license to be even more aggressive than they already were, something which will be seen in many of the subsequent frigate engagements of the war.